Egg Yolk Galapagos. She lived with her husband and 4 kids in a tiny house in Itawamba County, Mississippi, and my mother's life, as I see it now, was full of hardships. She was a pretty, fierce, stubborn woman, very trim and attractive, who seemed to house, like a Freudian annex to her being, a separate self in her organism, stashing it there like a guy on the lam. And if you could say that my mother was friendly and charming and outgoing, she was equally hard, innocently indomitable. She, in her own inchoate mind, having not had yet had time to soften into the subtler forms of decadence, that tapeworm with the colorful kaleidoscope back, flush with its ravenous, interminable Big Mac attack. She worked 8 hours a day at a pajama factory in Tupelo. I remember a funny thing we had going. At times, on the factory floor, her mind would wander, would go back perhaps for a moment to California, where she was from, the very antipode of this place. As she had been staring off into space, her pretty face perhaps with its mouth hanging ajar, on the beach again in fleet regalness and with light prisming endlessly in gold ribboning, helixing forbiddingly and tantrically, mantically. Her mantra mumbled, the grape flavored bubble gum she chewed over interludes of warp and wap and gruesome magma fire ant attack on nerve and sinew, renewed to a state of gasoline and foamy scald, the mauling of days, here unveiled and radiant with pain, only for her to look down and realize that, as my mother had walked along the beach in California far away, the factory machines had kept running, creating crazy pajamas with 6 sleeves and 9 pockets. She would take these botched pajamas home and show them to me, and as I pictured a boy with 9 arms and 5 legs, I would laugh and laugh, seeing his surreal anatomy in my head, a boy whose flesh was formed in the shape of a puzzle piece. And when I saw that vision in my head, when it accelerated into a cognitive fidelity such that I now saw it too clearly, too lucidly, I would stop laughing suddenly and my face would go dark. After her shift at the pajama factory, my mother drove home in her Datsun hatchback to our tiny house on Feimster Lake Road with its frozen yard slushed with dark matter, crunchy hush puppy substances running in long runneling rivulets into tunnels funneled, bored into the porous flesh of nothingness, as if vacuity itself were blubbered. My father, Billy Jean, arrived home from his job driving a Pepsi truck at around this time, and as the news played on the television in the otherwise dark living room on this winter dusk, my father drank beer and sat at the dining room table next to the kitchen where my mother was cooking supper, making little remarks to her about all the ways she had invented to make a mess of a man's dinner. This routine had been going on for years. There was something about natural light beer and the smell of burning okra that brought out, like a giant vodka-maddened sloth from out of a cave, a redneck connoisseur and food critic who existed in my father surreptitiously and whose palate was so sensitive that the least little odor or flavor could make him gag with tears flowing down his chubby pink cheeks. My father had a theory about the preparation of fried okra. On this subject, he could have composed an astute treatise. Okra was not to be burned, but it was to be black. There was a difference. It was my father's duty to define that difference every night. To him, the act of frying okra was a praxis, a thing which, when she did it, forced a woman to evolve. And yet my mother refused to evolve. She simply couldn't fry okra. Personally, I didn't feel that way, but my opinion didn't exist. She could get it black, that much was true, but it was either undercooked or overcooked, like a basketball player who always draws the front and back of the iron, never hitting the chords. In my memory, given to certain distortions which test the malleability of consciousness, the following events are encapsulated in a medium of frisson fandango, an atmosphere charged with the hard infarctions, rattling the hearts of all of us, my brothers and sister and I, bystanders to fate, gorgeous girl with the long flowing hair and the scalded pate, making faces of outrage and pain at us in the afflatus of days, caroling in pheromone fecundity straight away into hell's veering into steerless waste, promenading out past the last aghast stronghold of the known, clone of surrogate universe and rehearsed suicide before a mirror empirical, the funny face looking back at one lyrical, hysterical, unbearable. That is to say that a peculiar lighting exists in my memory of this event as if born of the glow propagated by bulbs of eternal fulmination and capsizement. My father, as he usually did, was making sarcastic remarks to my mother, who stood before the stove, cooking breakfast for supper, frying bacon and eggs in a hissing pan of water moccasin lisp and salty S's twisted into snapping soprano elocution, while my two brothers and my sister and I sat at the table, waiting for my mother to serve up supper to us. My father, as he sat there like a bonsai reddened by subtle, persistent, incurable forms of madness, which torture him but leaves him his reason intact, eyeing us with cold amusement, his eyes like tadpoles dyed blue, floating perfectly still in a puddle of glistening white gelatin. In the midst of this banal scene, which had been repeated countless times, my mind, going over something at school that day, was not in a state of high vigilance as it should have been at this meal, for many people have been blown to hell, casually puffing on a cigarette around propane tanks. With the articulation of a single sentence, its content having escaped me, my mother's hand, I noticed, began to slow as she rhythmically moved the hissing pan back and forth on the eye of the stove, slowing almost imperceptibly at first, but then so conspicuously that it caught the attention of my siblings, and more importantly, my father, whose eyes had begun to narrow dangerously, presage of wrath, a pursing of the gaze which my mother, her eyes having gone to him now, sized up with a leaden appraisal. Her eyes, as if in response to the shrinking of his, suddenly growing larger, not in surprise, not in wonder, but in a sort of reverse surprise, a sort of reverse wonder, a penetration, it seemed, newly accomplished in her organism, into the heart, into the nucleus of this matter, and the matter of all things. The universe having an astonishing retrograde devolved down to this micro-location in the midst of the squalid human wilderness of Mississippi, had consolidated itself into this square little room with the kitchen attached, a man, a woman, and 4 children, burning alive in the holocaust of sensation. And this became radiantly clear to me as my eyes went from my mother's hand holding the skillet perfectly still on the stove to her eyes widening with something subdued, elementary, inexorable, some bastard strain of animus having formed a nuptial with this moment crucified on the grid of space and time, and I could hear the chiming of glass fracturing in astral winds beyond the window as motionless hurly-burlies in furious tirade blew the curtains without moving them, that swept over the dinner table in a gale of as inexistent as it was invisible, a zephyr bereft of the heftiness of sensation, the implication being that we're all steaming to death in this place, erasing itself one moment to the next in the harebrained cathexis of a universe in crash and apocalypse. All this becoming very clear to me as I watched, fascinated now. My mother lift the pan, hissing and popping with hot grease, from the eye of the stove and hold it in her hand loosely, lightly, jauntily, like a professional tennis player, a darling of sports writers, cockily spinning his racket before the omnibus thunder of the serve. At the lunatic cockadoodle doodling of a rooster boosted out beyond the perimeter of the known, where forces remorses clone each other in fire and in stone, my mother, her gaze locked onto my father's, took the frying pan in her hand, popping and hissing with scalding hot eggs, and threw it with the last aghast tendril of her strength down onto the kitchen floor like a football player who freebased cocaine in the locker room at halftime and having just scored a touchdown at the beginning of the third quarter, spikes the ball so hard some guy in China feels a thump beneath his foot. The pan bounced off the floor and ricocheted upward, landing on the counter. The contents of the pan hit the ceiling, and I can see my mother very vividly in my memory, looking very beautiful as she wore, like a stole, the primordial wave trains, the animalian currents flowing in scandalous magmas through the tattered human brain, while a rain of bacon grease and scalding hot egg yolk rained from the ceiling and dripped down her face as her mouth was wrenched, literally twisted like a drinking straw, into a hideous smile which possessed an existential frankness, a heavy finality that fascinated me. Because of the lunacy of the circumstances, the mess my mother made that night wasn't cleaned up properly. From that day forward, there was a yellow egg yolk stain on the ceiling in the kitchen, and because I excelled at geography, I instantly recognized the shape of the Galapagos Islands, where, I learned, giant tortoises, just by existing, had completely altered the course of human civilization. These large, dull, slow animals were not my favorite in nature, for it occurred to me once that if one ever rubbed me the wrong way, I'd just flip it over and take off, leaving it to figure out the riddle of existence on its own. And I thought how, out of all the animals to change the course of history, the tortoise was the least intriguing and the most ridiculous. Looking on at the stain on the ceiling as I ate my cereal in the morning, my mind formed its childish Galapagos, a place of a sort of lunar shambles, palm treed, with shattered rock impacted in blasted scree beds screaming, "Don't step on me, don't step on me." And I knew, too, that the tortoises had something to do with the death of God, as if God, having died, first endowed the tortoises with the occult mystery of his death, swathed in a nebulousness that is eternal, and that out of the cloud of unknowing the tortoise would emerge, bearing on its shell the hieroglyphics, the astronomical scriptures of a demiurge seduced by sleep and extinction, and whose obituary contains great fluid estuaries of sadness, madness, into javelins hurled into the furious hurly-burly of surly eternity's blinding incarnadine eye. If you like this kind of content, please hit the like and subscribe button. Thank you very much.